The dust swirled thick around the carnival grounds as the last of the evening crowds dispersed, leaving behind trampled grass and the lingering scent of popcorn and cotton candy. Most folks headed home to their warm beds, but Jake Morrison lingered, near the shadowy corners where the sideshow tents stood like forgotten sentinels in the moonlight. He'd heard the whispers, seen the crude hand-painted sign that made his stomach turn, the Wild Woman of Borneo, too dangerous for decent folk. Something about those words gnawed at him as he approached the weathered canvas structure. Jake had been a cowboy all his life, working ranches across 3 states, and he'd learned to read animals and people alike. What he sensed here wasn't danger, it was fear, loneliness, and something else that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The carnival barker, a greasy man with gold teeth named Cornelius Pike, emerged from behind the tent flap counting a wad of crumpled bills. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Jake standing there in the dim light cast by a flickering oil lamp. "Show's over for the night, cowboy," Pike growled, stuffing the money into his vest pocket. "Come back tomorrow if you want to gawk at the freak." Jake's jaw clenched at the word, but he kept his voice level. "I'd like to see her now," Pike laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the night air. "She ain't receiving visitors. Besides, she's probably torn apart her cage again. Wild as a rabid wolf, that one. Found her living like an animal in the mountains of Borneo, they say. Can't even speak proper English." "How much?" Jake asked quietly. "What's that? How much to see her?" Now, Pike studied him with calculating eyes, sensing easy money, $5. "But I ain't responsible if she tries to claw your eyes out." Jake pulled out the coins without hesitation, though $5 represented nearly a week's wages. Pike pocketed the money and gestured toward a smaller tent attached to the main structure. "She's in there. Don't get too close to the bars, and don't try to feed her nothing. She bites." The smell hit him first as Pike lifted the tent flap. Unwashed bodies, stale hay, and something else that spoke of desperation and despair. A single kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across the small space, and there in the center sat a crude iron cage, barely large enough for a grown person to stand upright. At first, Jake thought the cage was empty. Then he saw her huddled in the far corner like a wounded animal, her face hidden behind a curtain of matted dark hair. She wore nothing but a tattered brown dress that might once have been decent clothing. Her feet were bare and dirty, her arms wrapped protectively around her knees. "There she is," Pike said with obvious pride. "Caught her myself in the jungles of Borneo. Took 6 men to subdue her, and she near about killed 2 of them. Look at them scars on her arms, probably from fighting tigers bare-handed." Jake stepped closer, ignoring Pike's warnings, and knelt beside the cage. The woman, for she was clearly a woman, probably no more than 25, lifted her head slightly. In the lamplight, he caught a glimpse of dark eyes filled with such profound sadness that it took his breath away. Her face, beneath the grime and neglect, was delicate and intelligent. Whatever Pike's story about Borneo, Jake knew with absolute certainty that this woman was no wild creature from a foreign jungle. "Ma'am," he said softly, the way he might approach a frightened horse, "my name's Jake Morrison." She stared at him for a long moment, then lowered her head again without speaking. But Jake had seen something in those eyes, not wildness, but a spark of humanity that had been nearly extinguished by months, or perhaps years of cruel captivity. "She don't talk much," Pike said. "When she does, it's all gibberish, foreign tongue. You know." Jake spent another 10 minutes there, not speaking, just sitting quietly beside the cage while the woman occasionally glanced at him with those haunting eyes. When he finally stood to leave, he turned to Pike with a question that surprised them both. "What would it take to buy her?" Pike's eyebrows shot up. "Buy her? She ain't for sale, cowboy. She's my star attraction. Brings in more money than the bearded lady and the snake charmer combined. Everything's for sale at the right price," Jake said. "Name it." Pike studied him shrewdly. "You got some kind of peculiar interests, mister? Because I ain't in the business of just name your price." After a moment's consideration, Pike threw out a number he clearly thought was impossible, $500. Jake nodded as if the sum didn't represent more money than he'd seen in his entire life. "I'll need 3 days to get it. Pike's confident smirk faltered. "You're serious, dead serious." Jake touched the brim of his hat and walked away, leaving Pike staring after him in bewilderment. For the next 3 days, Jake worked like a man possessed. He sold his horse, his saddle, his gun, everything he owned except the clothes on his back. He took on every odd job he could find in town, from mucking out stables to hauling freight. He played poker with his last few dollars and won, then played again and won more. He borrowed against future wages from the ranch where he worked, promising to labor for months without pay. On the 3rd evening, he returned to the carnival with exactly $500 in a leather pouch. Pike seemed genuinely shocked that he'd managed it. "I got to ask," Pike said as he counted the money, "what you planning to do with her? She ain't exactly wife material, if you catch my meaning. Can't cook, can't clean, probably can't even use an outhouse proper." Jake ignored the questions and waited while Pike unlocked the cage with obvious reluctance. The woman looked up as the door swung open, confusion and fear flickering across her face. Jake knelt down and extended his hand, palm up, the way he might offer sugar to a skittish mare. "Come on," he said gently. "You don't have to stay here anymore." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with infinite caution, she reached out and placed her grimy hand in his. Her fingers were trembling, and Jake felt something twist in his chest at how small and vulnerable she seemed. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. She was taller than he'd expected, probably reaching his shoulder, but thin to the point of fragility. Jake shrugged out of his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. Noting how she flinched at the unexpected kindness, "You're making a mistake," Pike called after them as Jake led her away from the carnival. "Grounds. She'll probably murder you in your sleep. Don't come crying to me when you wake up with your throat cut." Jake didn't bother responding. He could feel the woman's hand gripping his arm. As they walked through the darkness toward town, her steps, uncertain as if she'd forgotten how to walk on level ground. Every few yards, she would glance back fearfully, as though expecting Pike to come chasing after them. They reached Jake's small room above the general store. Just as the church bells were chimming midnight, it wasn't much, just a bed, a washstand, a small table and chair, but it was clean and warm. Jake lit the oil lamp and turned to find his unexpected guest standing frozen in the doorway, staring around the room as if she'd never seen such luxury. "It ain't the Palace Hotel," he said apologetically, "but it's better than that cage." She took a tentative step inside, then another. When she reached the washstand, she stopped and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above it. For a long moment, she simply stood there, one hand raised to touch her face as if she were seeing herself for the first time in years. Jake busied himself preparing a meal from his meager supplies: bread, cheese, some preserved meat, and clean water. When he turned around, he found her sitting on the edge of his bed, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Hey now," he said softly, setting the plate aside and approaching her carefully. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." She looked up at him, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, barely above a whisper, but the words were clear English with a refined accent that made Pike's stories about Borneo seem even more ridiculous. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me?" Jake sat down in the chair across from her, maintaining what he hoped was a respectful distance. "Because you needed helping, and because Pike was wrong. You deserve love too, just like anybody else." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't know what I am, what I've done. I know you're a human being who was treated worse than most folks treat their livestock. Whatever happened before don't matter now." Over the following hours, as dawn crept through the small window, her story emerged in fits and starts. Her name was Elena Hartwell, and she was the daughter of a respected judge in San Francisco. 2 years earlier, she'd been engaged to marry a wealthy banker's son when she discovered her fiancé's involvement in a series of brutal crimes against Chinese immigrants. When she threatened to expose him, he and his father had her declared insane and committed to an asylum. "I tried to tell them the truth," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "But who believes a madwoman? They said my accusations were delusions, symptoms of my condition. The doctors, they did terrible things to cure my hysteria. She'd escaped from the asylum 8 months ago, only to be captured by Pike and his associates who convinced people she was a wild woman from a foreign land. The story provided a convenient explanation for her sometimes erratic behavior and her fear of crowds and loud noises, after effects of her ordeal that Pike had twisted into evidence of her savage nature. I stopped fighting after a while. Shh,